Pipeline Studio is about understanding your workflow and knowing when it's running smoothly. Weave. Constraint, friction, and drift are not separate failures. They are stages of the same system unfolding over time. Constraint is how a pipeline defines itself, what it allows, what it excludes, what it quietly protects. At first, constraint is useful. It reduces noise, creates focus, keeps effort from dissolving into chaos. But constraint has a memory. It remembers what once worked. It remembers what once stabilized the system. And long after the environment changes, those memories remain encoded as rules. Most pipelines don't choose their constraints consciously. They inherit them from tools, from habits, from past success. That inheritance shapes behavior before any decision is made. It determines which ideas move easily and which require justification, which questions feel welcome and which feel disruptive. When constraint hardens, movement narrows. The system still runs, outputs still appear, but adaptability quietly disappears. This is where friction enters. Friction is not resistance for its own sake. It is what happens when reality presses against inherited limits, when intention meets structure, when effort meets shape. Friction feels inconvenient because it interrupts momentum, it slows things down, forces attention. And because of that, it's often treated as a defect. Systems don't ask what friction is saying, they ask how to remove it. They add layers, add tools, add process. The resistance fades, but the misalignment remains. What friction was pointing to is never examined. So the pressure relocates, people compensate. They remember what the pipeline forgets. They become the flexibility the system no longer has. This looks like professionalism, like commitment, like dedication, but it's unpaid interest on ignored friction. As compensation becomes routine, the system appears stable again. Constraint remains unchallenged. Friction is absorbed instead of understood. And this is where drift begins, not with collapse, with continuity. The pipeline keeps moving, schedules hold, metrics look fine, but decisions stop being intentional. What was once deliberate becomes habitual. What was once examined becomes assumed. Small compromises accumulate, each justified, each reasonable in isolation. Together they alter direction, not sharply, gradually. Drift is hard to detect because nothing breaks. The surface stays calm, the system grows quieter, stops pushing back, stops teaching, stops demanding clarity. Learning turns into maintenance, exploration into execution, curiosity into compliance. The pipeline becomes optimized for continuity instead of relevance, for motion instead of meaning. And because it still produces results, correction feels unnecessary, even irresponsible. Why disrupt something that works? But what works is no longer aligned. The system no longer reflects the environment it operates in. It reflects the version of reality it was built for. A moment that has already passed. Constraint, friction, and drift don't arrive one at a time. They coexist. Constraint shapes behavior. Friction tests those shapes. Drift is the result of what the system chooses not to hear. This is why pipelines don't fail suddenly. They fail quietly. By the time outcomes feel disconnected from effort, by the time work feels busy but not necessary, the system has already adapted itself around the problem. Correction feels costly. Change feels risky. Stopping feels unjustified until it isn't. Healthy pipelines are not optimized once. They are realigned repeatedly. They surface constraints before they harden. They treat friction as information, not obstruction. They correct drift before it feels urgent, not to be perfect, but to stay in contact with reality. Because a pipeline that can't feel reality will eventually stop responding to it. And when that happens, it doesn't matter how efficient it is. It's already gone somewhere it never meant to go. What makes this progression difficult to interrupt is that each phase reinforces the next. Constraint narrows possibility. Friction reveals the narrowing. Drift normalizes the result. And because each stage feels survivable on its own, the system adapts instead of correcting. The pipeline learns how to endure misalignment. At first, that endurance looks like strength. The system continues despite strain, despite mismatch, despite signals it no longer understands. But endurance is not resilience. Resilience requires feedback. Endurance replaces it. When constraint goes unexamined, friction becomes background noise. When friction is absorbed, drift becomes acceptable. And when drift feels acceptable, alignment is no longer expected. The system stops asking whether it still fits the moment. It asks only whether it still functions. That question is easier to answer. Function is measurable. Alignment is not. So the pipeline optimizes for what it can see: output, speed, consistency. And what can't be measured begins to disappear. Judgment, curiosity, context. These don't vanish all at once. They erode. They're replaced by procedures, by templates, by rules designed to prevent deviation instead of invite understanding. The system becomes safer and less aware. This is where correction becomes psychologically difficult. To question the pipeline now feels like questioning competence. To pause feels like falling behind. To adjust feels like admitting error. So the system doubles down. It explains away friction. It reframes drift as maturity. It treats constraint as discipline. And because nothing is visibly broken, these explanations hold until the environment shifts again. When reality changes faster than the pipeline can absorb, misalignment stops being theoretical. Decisions feel heavier. Outcomes feel delayed. Effort increases without corresponding impact. People sense this before systems do. They feel it as hesitation, as second guessing, as the quiet sense that something important is being missed. But the pipeline has no language for that feeling. So it keeps moving. This is the cost of a system that has lost contact with feedback. It cannot tell the difference between resistance and irrelevance, between friction that matters and noise it should ignore. Everything feels the same. At that point, adjustment no longer happens naturally. It must be chosen, and choice requires interruption, stopping, re-examining, surfacing assumptions that were never meant to be permanent. This is the moment most systems avoid, because interruption threatens continuity, and continuity has become the measure of success. But continuity without alignment is only delayed failure. The longer correction is postponed, the more expensive it becomes, not because change is inherently costly, but because drift has already accumulated interest. The pipeline has learned how to move without understanding why. It has learned how to function without listening. And when it finally must respond, it does so awkwardly, defensively, late. This is why healthy pipelines rehearse correction. They normalize pauses. They revisit constraints before they harden. They treat friction as rehearsal, not emergency. Not to prevent failure, but to preserve sensitivity. Because sensitivity is what keeps a system alive to its environment. And without that sensitivity, Even the most efficient pipeline eventually becomes a machine for producing the wrong thing very well. This concludes this session. Let what you've heard settle before continuing.